It was a rainy Sunday afternoon when I found the diary. My grandfather's house had that characteristic smell of old wood and books stored for decades. He had passed away 3 months ago, and I was there helping my mother organize his belongings. Among piles of yellowed photographs and old documents, my fingers touched something different at the bottom of his desk drawer. A brown leather-bound notebook, worn by time, with pages that seemed to guard secrets long forgotten. My grandfather had always been a man of few words. At family gatherings, he would sit in his favorite armchair, observing everything with that serene and distant look. He smiled when necessary, made brief comments about the weather or about how we were growing up. But he never talked about himself, about his youth, about the years before meeting my grandmother. It was as if his life had only begun when we became part of it. I opened the diary with trembling hands. The handwriting was firm and elegant, very different from the shaky letters I knew from his last notes. The first pages were dated 1953, when my grandfather was only 20 years old. He wrote about the city where he grew up, a small village in the countryside that doesn't even exist on maps today. He spoke of dirt roads, gas lamps, of a simple life, but full of impossible dreams for a poor young man of that era. In the following pages, I discovered that my grandfather had not always been the quiet and conformist man I knew. He dreamed of being a writer. He wrote poetry that he never showed anyone, stories about characters who lived on the margins of society. There were excerpts of unfinished stories, deep reflections on social injustice, about the desire to escape that predetermined life. Every word pulsed with a passion I never imagined existed in that seemingly placid man. Then I found her name, Marina. He wrote about her with an intensity that made me stop breathing for a moment. Marina was a teacher who had arrived in the village to work at the only local school. She came from the capital, brought books, new ideas, spoke about art and philosophy. My grandfather fell madly in love. He described each encounter as if it were sacred, each conversation as if it were the discovery of a new universe. For months, I followed this clandestine romance through the pages. Marina was married but unhappy. Her husband was an authoritarian man who had brought her to that village as a way of isolating her from the world. She and my grandfather met in secret, in the school library, on the riverbanks, anywhere they could steal a few moments of freedom. They planned to run away together. He wrote about a life where they would be free, where he could write and she could teach, where they would build a family based on love and not convenience. But then everything changed. In an entry dated September 1954, my grandfather wrote, with handwriting visibly altered by emotion, Marina's husband had discovered everything. There was a violent confrontation. Marina was taken away from the village in the middle of the night, and he never heard from her again. He tried to find her, wrote letters that were never answered, traveled to the capital but couldn't locate her. It was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth. The following pages were the most painful to read. My grandfather fell into a deep depression. He abandoned writing, burned all his manuscripts except that diary. He accepted a job in a factory, buried his dreams along with his hopes of finding Marina again. He wrote about how he felt a part of him had died, about how the world had lost its colors. For almost a year, his entries were short and mechanical, monotonous records of days that repeated without meaning. It was then that he met my grandmother. She appeared in the diary almost by accident, briefly mentioned as a daughter of the owner of the boarding house where he had moved. Unlike Marina, my grandmother was simple, practical, without great dreams or philosophical ambitions. But she was kind. She noticed his sadness and, without asking questions, tried to cheer him up with small gestures. A cup of coffee made with care, a funny comment at the right time, a genuine concern for his well-being. My grandfather wrote that he decided to marry her not out of love, but out of gratitude and exhaustion. He needed to move forward, build a normal life. Forget. My grandmother accepted his proposal with joy, not knowing she was receiving only half a man, the half that had survived the loss of Marina. Reading this broke my heart. I had loved my grandmother so much, and thinking that my grandfather had married her without true love made me feel an anger I didn't know how to process. But the following pages surprised me again. Over the years, my grandfather began to write about my grandmother differently. He described how she took care of him during his melancholic crises, how she never demanded explanations about his dark past. When my mother was born, he wrote about a happiness he didn't expect to feel again. And when my uncle arrived 3 years later, there was in the pages a genuine contentment, an acceptance of the life he had built. He never came to love my grandmother in the overwhelming way he loved Marina. That was clear in his words. But he developed something he himself described as deeper and more real. A love built in daily life, made of mutual respect, companionship, small shared joys. He wrote that Marina had been his great impossible love, but my grandmother had become his home, his safe harbor, the person who knew him better than anyone even without knowing about his past. The entries became more spaced out over time. There were long intervals between one note and another. He recorded births of grandchildren, small family achievements, occasional reflections on the passage of time. In an entry from 1982, he mentioned seeing a woman who looked like Marina in a market. His heart raced, but when he approached, he saw it wasn't her. He wrote that he felt as much relief as disappointment, and realized at that moment that he had finally left the past behind. One of the last long entries was from 2003, shortly after my grandmother's death. My grandfather wrote a letter to her in the diary pages, knowing she would never read it. He asked for forgiveness for not being able to love her fully in the early years, but thanked her for staying by his side anyway. He wrote that she had saved his life in a way she never knew, that she had transformed his darkness into light gradually, day by day, and that, in the end, he had learned that there are different forms of love, and all of them are valid and precious. There were still some entries from recent years, shorter and with the shaky handwriting I recognize. He wrote about loneliness, about longing, about memories that return more frequently in old age. He mentioned Marina occasionally, always with affection but without the sharp pain from before. He wrote more about my grandmother, about how he missed her in every detail of the day. The last entry was from 2 weeks before his death. On that last page, my grandfather wrote that he was at peace, that he had lived a good life, despite everything, that his regrets were few, and that, if he could go back, he wouldn't change anything fundamental, because each choice had led him to us, his family. He wrote that he hoped to meet my grandmother again, wherever she was, and that perhaps he could also finally have news of Marina, know that she had been happy somewhere, somehow. I closed the diary with tears streaming down my face. Throughout my entire life, I thought I knew my grandfather, but he had been a complete stranger, a man with depths I never suspected existed. That quiet old man who took me fishing on Sundays had been a frustrated poet, a passionate lover, a broken heart who learned to love again in a different way. I thought about Marina, about where she might be now, if she was still alive, if she ever thought about that young man she loved in a forgotten village. I thought about my grandmother, about her infinite kindness, about how she had loved a man who kept so much inside himself. And I thought about my grandfather, about how he carried that weight alone throughout his entire life, transforming his pain into silence and his silence into strength to care for all of us. I put the diary back in the drawer, but now with renewed respect. Those pages contained the soul of a man who had been much more complex than any of us imagined. I decided not to tell anyone about what I had discovered. They were his secrets, which he chose not to share in life. But now I saw him differently, with more compassion, with more understanding about the invisible layers that exist in each person. I left the house that afternoon with a lesson I would carry forever. We all carry untold stories, lost loves, abandoned dreams. My grandfather taught me that it's possible to survive the deepest pain, rebuild a life, find happiness even when it comes in a different form than we imagined. And most importantly, he taught me that we never completely know the people we love, that there are always unexplored depths, secret chapters that shape who they are. Today, when I look at his photographs, I see not only the grandfather I knew, but also the young dreamer, the passionate lover, the man who learned to transform loss into love in a new way. And I'm grateful that he existed in all these versions, that he kept his stories in that brown leather diary, leaving behind a legacy much richer and more human than any of us could have imagined. The old diary revealed not only his past, but the universal truth that we are all mysteries, even to those who know us best.